Welcome to the second installation of the Print and Paper series. We started this series in the library a while ago to give people a chance to do something with their hands and to explore different aspects of prints and book production and book language. And I'm delighted that we have two fabulous colleagues today helping us out. Keegan Osinski is one of our librarian colleagues in Divinity, and Emily Weiner is the interim curator of the gallery. So as we go on, feel free to interrupt and ask questions or put them in the chat. Keegan's going to talk a little bit about about lettering and give us a chance to practice with our books or from last week or paper, depending on what you have. And then Emily is going to show us some fabulous treats, and we'll have a chance to ask both of them questions and take your book from blank to blue. So here, I'm going to turn it over to you, Keegan, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely. This is really fun. So mostly we kind of talked a little bit when we were planning this workshop about like, okay, do you call it calligraphy or what exactly, you know? So I don't do calligraphy. Calligraphy is like an actual thing. I mostly just do what I call hand lettering. And basically I just learned from, honestly, so my mom has been an avid like crafter my whole life. I remember, you know, always she was doing scrapbooking, rubber stamps, and like making cards and stuff like that. So she has gorgeous handwriting, and she does a lot. I've grown up watching her do hand lettering for her scrapbooks and all of that. And so recently, a few years ago, you probably have heard me talk about my bullet journal before. And so that's mostly where I do a lot of my hand lettering. So I have my bullet journal here that I can just kind of show you in this other frame. And so what I'm going to do is basically show you how to do something like this and just like the basics of fake calligraphy. So basically how it works is you want to use a brush pen. You can also use a regular Crayola marker, like the fat ones, you know, that have kind of the like stubby end. But a brush pen is going to be your best bet. So all of your upstrokes are going to be skinny and all of your downstrokes are going to be fat. So if you do, say, the letter A, your upstroke is skinny, and then your downstroke is fat. Your upstroke is skinny, your downstroke is fat. The other way you can do this in a fake way is with any kind of regular pen. And you can make your letter A, right? And then you can kind of fake the fat parts by kind of filling in. So you can see with the brush pen how the downstrokes are fat and the upstrokes are skinny. And then with the regular pen, you just kind of fake the fat downstrokes. The way to kind of get the fat downstroke, if you're using a Crayola marker or something that's not really, or even if you're using an actual brush pen, is basically to like push down harder. So the skinny upstroke, you're going to kind of be light so that you only use the very tip of the pen. And then the downstroke, you kind of press hard to get that fat edge. You can also kind of just like manipulate the pen to like lean on the fat edge to get the fat downstroke. And then focus the upstroke just on the very tip. So this is also how you would use like a, let me see if I have one of those like chisel point Sharpies. So skinny up and then fat down, and then skinny up and fat down. So the other thing I kind of wanted to show, in addition to like the basics of how to make the calligraphy looking lettering, is blending the colors with your brush pens. Okay, so basically what you want is two colors, a lighter color and a darker color. Maybe I'll try to use this one anyways. So you're gonna start with your lighter color. So I just wrote the word April in my lighter color. And then what I'm gonna do is just kind of color the bottom. Like I'm gonna kind of split the letters in half and color the bottom with the darker color. And then I have, this is like a clear vert pen to kind of blend. So you can do that, or you can go back to your lighter color and use that to blend out the darker color at that line. The thing with hand lettering is it just takes a lot of practice. Like I'm still not very good at it. I follow a lot of like bullet journaling accounts on Instagram that are just like, they have gorgeous lettering and like bullet journal spreads, and it's so inspiring, but like my lettering is not nearly as good as theirs. I kind of like it a little bit messy. It looks more, it's kind of like watercolor-ish. And there are, you can find like printable downloads on online. Either like you can buy them on Etsy, or there's free ones available too that are just like templates that you can use to practice, just like tracing the letters over and over for the alphabet. And that can be helpful. Or the other thing, I just like will copy a lot. Like I'll just look at Instagram and then like be like, okay, I'm gonna try that, like the way that they loop that letter or whatever. So that's pretty much all I have. Any other questions, or does anyone else want to show what they've tried? Yeah, no, that you got that shading. That's good. Also, Mary Anne, yeah, Pinterest board is a great idea for like.
So April.
Yeah.
You know, yours looks great. Mine looks kind of.
Oh, that looks good. Sure.
Colors are pretty.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And I see. Yeah, you got the idea of the skinny stroke, the fat downstroke. That takes a lot of practice.
I have to confess to you, Keegan, that I do calligraphy with a real calligraphy pen.
Oh yeah.
I don't know what to do with these big fat marker things. A box of them, and I don't know what. I can't make them look like. It's just totally a different look.
Yeah.
You have favorite pens, Keegan?
I do mostly like these Tombos, and I like. There's also a smaller. Oh, maybe I have one.
Hillary, the Tombos have two ends, which sometimes
Yeah,
is
that's
nice.
true.
Yeah.
If you're lettering and then you're also writing, so you have the exact same color.
Yeah, I do really like the kind of fake version where you kind of just like fill in the fat sections. That is kind of a easy way to fake it, and it still can like look pretty.
These are so inspirational, Keegan. And just that one tip of like fat down and skinny up, it makes you feel like I could break through into this world of bullet journaling.
That's really, that's really the trick to it. And a lot of practice.
I was just going to say, can you give us any tips on when you were first learning, a website that you particularly liked, or a person that you follow that is for beginners?
I'm trying to remember. There's also a lot of YouTube videos that I've watched. There's not really any one person.
Okay.
And then I think there's also like some workbooks or like books that you can get that I want to say they call it like modern calligraphy or something like that. Oh, so Hillary's showing a workbook, coloring book type thing. That's cool.
My handwriting's atrocious, and I find
Look
it really
down, Hillary.
relaxing.
Show it again.
Yeah.
Ah, cool. Okay.
Cool.
And there's like so many different styles you can try. And I really just kind of scroll through like hashtags of like hashtag hand lettering or bullet journal or stuff like that. And there's tons of talented people out there.
Mm-hmm.
There's people who also do it on an iPad with like an Apple Pencil and in either Notes or Procreate.
Mhm.
Those are really cool too. I'm not great with my Apple Pencil.
Could you do numbers 1 to 10, Keegan, just to show what they look like?
Yeah. So it's basically the same kind of trick that you want to do. And like, there's not, I mean, you can follow a template so they all look a certain way, but it's going to be the same where you do skinny up, fat down.
You really have to get the knack of pushing down harder
Yeah, it really takes a lot of.
and then letting up.
Do you find it splits your pen nib, the brush pen?
Not these because they're kind of designed for it.
Mhm.
Once I started kind of trying with the Crayola ones, they do get a little squished, but yeah. So it's really just about practicing that letting up and pushing down, like Shore said, for the skinny up, fat down.
Hard.
And then so sideways is sort of skinny sideways.
Mm-hmm. That's kind of why I like the bullet journal because, you know, some weeks are kind of ugly and then you just like, that's okay, I'll try something different next week. I'm actually, I need to set up my April. So I'm kind of glad I was experimenting with this. I might do something like this for my
Mhm.
April month.
I keep a garden journal every year with my garden and do watercolors. But I've
Nice.
thought about actually looking at the lettering because my handwriting is terrible. I might try doing something like this to put into my journal.
Well, and you could do it. You could do it with watercolor too. So, I mean, because these are, brush pens, I mean, if you have a paintbrush, you could do, basically, it's the same idea. You would just kind of do skinny up and then fat down with your paintbrush.
Feels like it might need more control because the medium is thinner.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, but no, I love this. Thank you.
Or, you know, what you could do is like do the fake version. So if you had like word garden, you could kind of do these like fake downstrokes and then color in those downstrokes with paint, with watercolors. That might be kind of pretty. Okay, well, that's all I got. Let's hear from Emily.
That's great. That's great. Thank you, Keegan.
Well, thank you so much, Keegan. I feel like I learned so much. How are those for my first try? Not great, but.
Yeah, no, those look great.
Okay, good. Well, maybe I'll try to do a letter once I mix up some tempera paint. So which is a water-based paint. We could try that for Celia. Okay, great. Well, so my experience with mixing paint my experience with paint just started when I was a kid. I've always loved painting. Painting is what I do primarily. I'm a painter. My MFA is in painting, and I've been teaching painting on the college level for almost a decade, starting in 2011. So I'm going to give a really brief history of pigments, kind of focusing on the color blue. Very brief. It's not a comprehensive history, but then I want to go into a few examples of what goes into paint and what goes into making paint. So although you probably won't be able to do it at home because these tools are not only are they, hard to get, but they're also messy, and you could buy this tubed with a lot more convenience and more purity. Or it's just when you understand what it took to bring these pigments to where they are now, where you can just buy them in a tube at the art supply store, it gives you a better appreciation for what these are and what the act of painting or drawing or even writing entails. So as I said, a really brief history of pigments. In prehistoric times, people were using pigments. Early man used earth pigments on cave walls, so the yellow, reds, white chalk. So those were like the yellow ochre, red earth. And those were sourced right from the ground. I mean, they were literally earth. And they had some kind of binder that would keep them on the cave wall. So casein, which is like a milk bind, from a derivative of milk, that's what kind of kept them there. So it wasn't just water and pigment stuck on the wall, but there has to be some kind of binder. And then by 3000 BC, in Egypt and China, there was like real production of pigments happening. So that's when we first see Egyptian blue, which is like one of the earliest blues is indigo. I'm wearing an indigo dyed shirt. So indigo is a dye, which is different from a pigment, but you could also make a pigment from a dye. So a pigment is more of like a particle, but you can use dyes to make pigments. Anyway, so by 3000 BC, Egyptian blue was produced, and that was a glass that was made from sand and copper. And so that was like a really great pigment. And about 4,000 years later, like when we're going into like the late medieval, early Renaissance period, more than 4,000 years later, that's like where we see one of the most amazing pigments, which is ultramarine blue. And at the time, ultramarine blue was the most valuable pigment. It comes from the semi-precious stone lapis lazuli. So I have some lapis here, and I'll show you. You probably have, everybody's probably has worn or seen jewelry made from lapis. So this would make the pigment ultramarine blue, like a true ultramarine. So this is ultramarine from Kremer Pigments in New York, is like this wonderful store, which is almost like an apothecary for pigments. It's where conservators go to get their pigments. Painters go to make, anything from their own gesso to their own paints and watercolor. Even I know like people who make instruments go there for special glues like fish glue, and they're incredible. They also have contemporary pigments, but they also have the old school, old master stuff. So I have some lapis here. So, in the medieval period, it was called ultramarine. It comes from the Latin ultramarinus, which means beyond the sea, because it was literally from beyond the sea. You would have to go to Afghanistan, mostly Afghanistan, to source this. And then it would be taken back. And then through a laborious process of grinding and then washing, you would finally get this pure pigment. So yeah, lapis was about 10 times the cost of gold. And because of that, it was reserved for only the finest paintings and the most important subjects. So that's why in a Renaissance painting, you'll see only Mother Mary has a cloak with the ultramarine blue. And also there are other blues that are used in painting. So smalt is one of those. It's something like the Egyptian blue. It has copper in it. It's a lesser blue. So if it's a painting that usually has like a greener cast and it's not as well done, it's probably smalt, or it might be azurite, which is another pigment not as precious as lapis or ultramarine blue. Right, so access was everything if you wanted these really fine pigments. But then moving into the 1800s, that's when trade routes opened, and that was coupled with advances in technology and science. And the first chemically synthesized color is Prussian blue, and that was created by accident in the early 1800s in a laboratory. It was, a Prussian blue is like, this is a painting in progress, and when I paint, I use a lot of different blues to make a gradient, just like I'd use a lot of different, yellows. And what is so great about the spectrum of pigments is they all have their own property that's slightly different. So like Prussian blue, for example, is down here, and it is like a darker, more of like a saturated, almost like a bully color, like it just takes over. And ultramarine is slightly lighter, but also kind of has that transparency. And then moving up to cobalt and some cerulean. So all these blues have really different feelings, that they read as blue, but when you see them together, they have a difference. So Prussian blue was like a new blue that was introduced. So we have ultramarine and then Prussian. And then soon after that, in the 1800s, a French chemist created a low-cost French ultramarine. So it was chemically the same, but so like the cost was so much lower. So it was identical to genuine ultramarine. And so that's what I have here. I have some of this ultramarine blue. So this is amazingly cheap. I bought this is probably $6, and I can make a whole kind of tub of paint out of this. So that's where we are today. All along with those new pigments and those new colors in the 1800s, we also got, Impressionism, and that's kind of, the pigments which were synthesized in labs, and we got these like cadmiums and really big heavy metals that we only could synthesize because we had these fiery furnaces in the Industrial Revolution. In addition, we got a paint tube. So that allowed painters to go outside and do plein air paintings. And it wasn't the kind of workshop that it used to be where you'd have to physically mix your paint like I'm about to do, and then use it immediately before it dried. You can buy a prefabricated tube and bring it out into plein air and paint. So then, in the 20th and 21st centuries, these new pigments are continually being invented and discovered. The most recent, I believe, is a pigment called Yinmin blue, which is a really intense and perfect kind of blue color that is, if you look at, if the color wheel is like a chroma on the outside of the color wheel with like neutrals into this kind of core, the blue of the Yinmin would be like way on the outside, like a super bright, beautiful blue. It's still pretty expensive because it's new, but that was also an accidental discovery by a professor at Oregon State University and one of his graduate students. So if you're interested more in learning about, the varieties of blue and pigments, I'd recommend going to the Kremer Pigments website and just exploring them generally. It's really amazing when you start to realize like the plethora of possibilities for pigments and even, paints. Okay, oh, and I wanted to say, as I go along, especially in this demo part, if you have any questions as I go along, I know it may be hard to see this here, or I don't know, just out of curiosity, if I'm saying something that sparks another idea, please just interrupt, because that might take us on a different path that will be interesting too. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm not going to use this lapis because this is a little precious still. I mean, even though it's not more than gold, I'm going to save this. So I'm going to mix two paints, one water-based and one oil. And I'm going to be using the same pigment. So I'll use one pigment to make two different kinds of paints. The first I'll do is tempera. So I'm first just going to like put out a little bit of pigment on my palette. Mixing paint is a little bit like cooking in that there are recipes. There's like an artist, the artist manual. But really it's like you do it for consistency, for color, for taste. So a little bit goes a long way. So I'm just going to put a little bit on my palette. I have some water here. And because this pigment egg is water-based, it dissolves in water, I'm first going to make a little bit of a dispersion so that this pigment will mix with the tempera a little bit better. So I'm just doing a couple drops of water in the pigment. Can you see this? Or not very well? I can do a close-up too. I want to see what this looks like. So I'm going to take my palette knife and I'm just mixing it in. It kind of feels like when you add cornstarch and water together, it's like has a little bit of a resistance at first, or like a kind of chalkiness. And the cool thing about pigments is, just like different ingredients in cooking, each pigment has its own personality. Some are hydrophilic, like they love mixing with water. Some are hydrophobic. They kind of don't want to mix. So with certain pigments, you might, if you're using a water-based paint, or you're using it towards a water-based mix, you might want to, get it as a dispersion. And a place like Kremer already offers those. But ultramarine is like a very giving pigment. So you'll see I have this nice little dispersion here. It looks like paint right now. So technically I could go about painting with it, but as soon as this dried, it's not very, it wouldn't last long. Eventually it would just break back down after it dried into its pigment, so it would fall off. So what we really need is a binder, and the binder in egg tempera is egg. I just cracked an egg. I separated out the yolk from the egg. because in egg tempera, it's just the yolk that works as the binder. If you're using it, and you're storing it, often you'll add something that's like like clove oil or something else that prevents it from going bad because it's egg. But if you use it immediately, it will create a film, and then it lasts an amazingly long time. This is how it was made in the Renaissance. So this stuff, even though you think of egg as something that goes bad very quickly, amazingly, once it's dry into a film, it is really very stable, a very stable medium. So I'm just going to put a couple of drops of egg yolk in here. This egg yolk has been sitting out a little bit, so it's a little bit loopy. But when it's super fresh, you might get like a farm fresh egg, and it should be a little bit more less viscous than this. But anyway.
I feel like kind of silly, but I had no idea there's egg in paint.
Well, there's egg in egg tempera. So like tempera paint, almost all tempera paint is, that's by nature what it is.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. Like, shrimp. Yeah.
Right there with you, Keegan.
Yeah, watercolor is a different medium, and oil painting is a different medium. It's the same pigment, so it's the same ingredient that makes it blue, but a different the same pigment that makes it blue, but a different medium for each one, which gives it different properties, different drying times, and different, just like a different personality. So just like pigments have a different personalities, and then their mediums have different personalities. Or their
also the word medium, like that makes so much sense. Like obviously, like it's the medium that like gets the pigment onto the, like I feel like I should have known that already.
No, and this was something that actually I think because of these colors are so readily available to us in our society, like post-industrial way of living, you don't really think of where they come from or how they're created or what really comprises the substance itself. So it was only when I started teaching painting processes class where I was mixing gesso and really doing all this, it's like that's when I learned. It's not a given at all. I don't think many people know this unless they've been interested to learn or forced to learn. Okay, so now I have tempera paint, and that's it. This is so simple, but this is like a breakthrough for artists. So I'm gonna just I'll do a little quick. So I usually use this on on watercolor paper, or like in the Renaissance, you'd make a panel and you put gesso on the panel. So gesso is it's a mixture of chalk, a white pigment, like a lead white, and a binder for that. So it would be like rabbit skin glue. And people still use that. So here, I'm gonna do skinny up. And then
So Emily, I have a question. If you left your little kind of blotch of paint out, how long would it stay usable?
Not very long at all, because tempera it kind of is this notoriously fast drying, easily absorbed paint. So the technique of tempera painting is so different from oil painting, which is the opposite. Oil stays open for a long period of time. So like to make technically to make a really amazing tempera painting, you have to do a lot of teeny tiny strokes, because even within a long stroke of paint, your paint will start drying, almost on your brush. So it's fast, it's really fast drying. So
would you make a large, do you make it then constantly in small quantities every like half hour or something?
Yes, I guess you would. You could always put this in a bottle and close it. And then especially if you put some kind of, something in it that would prevent it from going bad, then it could stay longer. But I think, early on, people were just mixing it as they went. And that was part of like the atelier, the like workshop system. You had people who were just starting out in your workshop, and they were the ones who would grind your pigment and wash your pigment. And then another group of people would be like, mulling your pigment and making it into paint. And so you had this constant flow of assistants who were making your paint as you created your painting. And some of them were helping you actually do the painting. So yeah, so I think, Celia, you could probably do your watercolor like this. You'd probably just need a really thin brush. So let's see, maybe a thinner brush. These long skinny brushes are like approximation of that paintbrush. or the paint pen. So up, that would be a down. Not as close. It's not as nice as Keegan's, but might work. Okay, so that's tempera. Watercolor would be a different, it would just be a different medium. Same with gouache, which is essentially watercolor medium with some chalk added for opacity. And now I'm going to do an oil, a little bit of an oil demo, and I'll focus a little bit more on this. But if it starts to get boring, just let me know and I'll stop, or I'll just rein it in a little bit. So I'm just washing off my brush, and I'm going to wash off my palette here.
I'm curious how you wash that. Is that paper, like a paper towel, or is it something you can wash?
This is well, the palette itself, it's a glass. It's a piece of glass cut to fit on the top of this. It's kind of like a restaurant cart. But glass palette is like really what you want to use to mix paints, because you could buy paper palettes, like disposable ones in the art store, but you'll see when I start to use this is called a muller. You really want like a hard surface, because you're essentially kind of like grinding the pigment into the medium to disperse it evenly. So yeah, this is a perfect setup. Like you'll see this often in artist studios, like a restaurant cart with a piece of glass cut to fit, so it just kind of sticks in there. All right, so I'm gonna put my tempera away. Now, okay, oil painting this was discovered later than tempera paint. So a lot of some of the paintings that we have in the Vanderbilt collection are tempera and oil, or some of them, the earlier ones, are just tempera. Oil painting oil was like a breakthrough. It started in the Northern Renaissance. And essentially it's the same thing, except you use an oil that is like, it's called a drying oil. So it's an oil that oxidizes to create a paint film in the same way that, you know, the egg yolk creates almost like a plasticky film over time. It evaporates water. Oil does it slightly differently. It oxidizes, so it reacts with oxygen to create a film. It takes longer though. So that's like the beauty of oil paint, is that you could work on a face and kind of, you know, finesse the shades and the values, and also have this transparency of underpainting and layers upon layers. It also has a longer kind of open time. So like you said, like you could probably mix up a batch of oil and it would be good for a while. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to put some pigment down, and for this one I'm going to do a little bit more. I like to do these kind of like in a batch, and then I'll tube it, and then I could paint with it. It lasts years. Okay, so just like cooking, I'm going to add a little bit kind of to taste, just until I get a consistency that I feel like is not too dry, not too wet. It's a hard one to get to, but it's like you wanted it, the consistency that you would have paint when it comes out of a paint tube, like toothpaste. So I'm gonna just slowly keep adding this a little bit at a time. If I was being really precise, I might use like an eyedropper. I'll do that. My eyedroppers are all filled with crusty paint, so just excuse that. So I'm basically just doing a preliminary, just like mixing it in, almost like you'd fold in the wet materials into your dry materials when you're baking. So I'm just gonna start with this. I think I just need like one more squirt. If we were in person, you could see this a little bit better. But, okay, so I've got like my kind of, it's like a paste now, but it's really chunky. So if I were to try to paint with this, I'd start like, you know, from one side to the other, there'd be like thin parts and then really like chunky parts that look like comets across my painting. So what I want to do is I want to make a really good dispersion so that basically the pigments are just surrounded by oil molecules so that they're not clumping together. And to do that, I'm going to use something called a muller. So this muller, it looks like a mortar, you know, a pestle, like a mortar and pestle, but it's slightly different in that it has a flat bottom. This is like a hand-blown glass piece that was made in Brooklyn. And on the bottom, it's kind of like sanded down, so it's gritty and super flat. So I'm just gonna start to, I'm just gonna mull it. So I'm in a circular motion. I'm getting the paint to like kind of become like a really flat, thin thing so that I'm like mushing the pigments inside of the oil. And I would do this like, you know, if I was in I was a Renaissance, you know, workshop, I do this over and over and over again. So this is kind of a laborious process where you scrape it into the middle, and then you mull it, and then you do it again and again and again. But what you wind up with is really beautiful paint. And you can't smell this, but it smells really good. You could use a few different oils, drying oils. This is linseed oil, which comes from the flax plant, but people use walnut oil, which has a little bit of like a creamier consistency and a similar drying time, or poppy oil, which you'd want to use with any kind of paints that you don't want to yellow, because linseed oil has a tendency to yellow. So like if you want to paint it with a really brilliant white, you'd use poppy. And poppy lasts, it stays open a really long time. So it has like the slowest drying time. So every kind of oil binder has a different property. So I do this over and over, and you'll see like even just to make a tiny bit of paint, it's a lot of labor. Like commercial paint factories have like big drums where the paint passes through two big drums, kind of like, I don't know, like in a chocolate factory or something. So there's nobody really doing this anymore except specialists like, you know, artists who really are into this, and there are quite a lot of them. And so after I go through this, I either paint with it right away, like I might just use this as a ground to my painting, or I tube it. I'll show you what it looks like. I'm adding a little bit of oil because this is a little bit thick. But yeah, it's beautiful, and it's transparent, and it's oil paint, and it will dry just like any kind of oil paint you bought in the store, but then you have the satisfaction of knowing from start to finish how it was made.
That is very cool. Thank you, Emily.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm gonna tube this so that I can work with it later. And I'm very curious. I've never painted with real lapis. So this is the first opportunity I've ever had to like try this out at some point. I think during the Renaissance, medieval and Renaissance exhibition, I'm going to do a demo and then make a little bit of paint with this so that we can actually use it. So I'll let you know how different this looks from that, if it looks different at all.
And then what kind of sort of overlayer would you glaze your painting with after it's all down and you're happy with it and you're moving on to the next step?
Then okay, so oil painting is all about layering. Like the beauty of an oil paint comes from, you have, you know, when you see this like luminous image, it looks like light is coming from the center of it or coming out from it. Like Hudson River School paintings where like there's a bright light in the back. It looks like the farthest away, but there's like sun just shining right at your face. Well, that is because light actually is coming through it. It's coming through, it's hitting the ground, the white ground, and then it's bouncing between these paint layers. So something like this, this is like 3 layers of paint. So say I put down 1 layer of blue, I'd wait for it to dry, and then I'd do another gradient of the blue that's transparent. And then I'd wait for that to dry, and maybe I'd do 1 more gradient here. So this has this quality, it's probably hard to see it on screen, but it has a different, kind of like a vibrancy and a light, like a dynamism that you can't get from flat, just like a 1 layer of paint. So probably what I would do is do the same thing on top of that. So like same blue, but I do another layer. So it would start to be not so transparent, and the brush strokes would start going away too, because the layers would kind of blend together.
You mentioned that what your final painting looks like would change depending on what kind of oil you used. Would that also be true with whatever your final glazing layer would be?
Yes, because if you use, say I use more oil in my last layer, the last layer is going to look shiny. And in the first layer, because it's probably like getting absorbed by the gesso, which is like a chalk kind of ground, it might be more dull. So say, you know, if part of my painting, that last glaze layer had a lot of oil in it, it would be really shiny, and, you know, you could still oil it out, but I think that's like the beauty of mixing your own paint. You can calibrate how much of, like, how matte, how glossy, how transparent, how opaque you want it to be. It's like it's like when you have I don't know, like when you have an instrument and then there's like different ways to tune it. It's really similar. I feel like painting is a lot like playing the guitar or any other instrument. It's like you kind of, the more you do it, it really is practice and kind of getting a muscle memory for it, in a way of like understanding that, you know, alizarin crimson has a much slower dry time than ultramarine blue. Or, you know, this is why, you know, certain pigments you do an underpainting with. So a pigment like an earth color dries really fast. That's why underpaintings are made with like a burnt sienna, raw sienna, or a raw umber. Those dry in a day. But like a titanium white, that would take a really long time. So grisaille underpaintings, they take, you know, you can spend more time with them. Yeah. So the answer, I guess that was an elaborate answer to your question. But
No, that's really, really interesting. Thank you. I love the idea that you're saying it smells good too.
oh, it smells so good. Well, you know, it's like as a painter, or like, you know, as a librarian, or, you know, whatever you do, it's like that thing that you love the most has a very good connotation or a very good association. And oil paint definitely has that.
I just want to say, so one thing about pigments that, like, I didn't realize how pigments were like discovered, and like there's new ones like being discovered. I watched this documentary about the art forgeries at the Knoedler. And they were talking about how one of the reasons they were able to like figure out that like the Jackson Pollock was fake was because there was a pigment in there that like didn't even exist until 1974, and like he died in 1956. So like, and like that just blew my mind that they were able to figure it out, because like that pigment did not exist at that time.
Yes, I feel like, you know, I just started to get into the world of, you know, speaking to conservators and, you know, conserving artworks for the art collection at Vanderbilt. And it really is like forensics, what they're doing. You know, they're looking at a painting and they're taking chemical tests of what, you know, how it was made. They're doing like X-ray shadow graphs of the layers of paint to try to recreate and fill in the gaps of what had been, you know, what was missing. And trying to use the same materials and materials that can be taken off, you know, so that if, you know, in time there's a better way to conserve, what they do can't be undone. So there's like so much of forensics involved.
Yeah. And it's interesting because you can also apply those paint analysis, whether it's for paintings. You can also do it for layers on your walls. If you want to know what, you know, if you live in a house that was built in 1700 and you want to know what the paint scheme was, or was there wallpaper, if you take a tiny sample and analyze it under a microscope, you'll find all the different layers of things. And it helps a lot of historic site curators and conservators work on colors. Like there was a famous restoration done of the colors to the dining room at Mount Vernon, and it was done in the late 80s, and people were shocked because the colors were so bright. It was a very, very bright green, and they had based it all on analysis of the pigments from these tiny little samples that are, you know, the size of a fingernail paring. You look at them under a microscope and you can build a trail of evidence for what an interior would have looked like.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
So Emily, you're continuing to do that, and I know you want to put that in your tube. How long are you going to do that after we leave you?
Probably not long. I mean, if I was like obsessive, then I could probably do this for like, you know, another 20 minutes after we're done. But
Okay. I was just trying to get an idea of how long you would be at it, you know.
like I usually only do this for demos, but then once I start doing it, I'm glad I did. It's just that it's so much work, and what you could buy a tube of ultramarine paint for versus like, getting your setup and buying the pigments, but making it and being able to use a tube that you mix yourself is so special.
Mm-hmm. After all that work, for sure.
Yeah. What do your tubes look like before you fill them, Emily?
Oh, they just look like toothpaste tubes that are
Oh,
not.
okay. Oh, wow. Okay. So, okay.
Oh.
Cool.
Yeah, I can show you what it's like to put them in there. Basically, it's just like scooping it in like you would like a pastry. I mean, I'm always making food analogies. This tube's a little bit big for the amount of paint that I have, but I'm just kind of like stuffing it in like you would a pastry bag or whatever. And then once this is all filled, I just tap it all down and then I crimp it just like a toothpaste tube.
That's so cool.
Paint, you just puncture the top and then it squeezes out from the top.
I feel like we could listen to you telling us like at least another hour's worth of information.
Well, I'm always happy to. This is my favorite thing in the whole world. So,
Well, let's do red in the fall.
always happy to talk about paint.
Okay, cool.
That is so awesome. And the name of the place in New York, Premier Pigments, is that what you said?
Kremer, Kremer. It's the last name of this German, I guess he's like a colorist that owns this store. And there's one in Cologne, I think, or somewhere in Germany. He's a really cool person. And then they carry all kinds of stuff. It's really cool, but you can get anything shipped from online.
Great. Well, thank you, Keegan, and thank you, Emily. This has been so wonderful. I've learned so much.